Test. Good evening, everyone. How are you? Good to see you. This is our first evening lecture of the history of the Adams County Historical Society in this building. Thank you. I'm Andrew Dalton. I'm the director here, and we have a wonderful staff and volunteers who put this together. Abby Hoffman, our director of programs, is over there. And it's so nice. We've had, literally thousands of visitors to the museum in less than a month from 40 different states. We've completed our capital campaign. We've raised over $12 million debt-free to make this facility possible. We have over 50 volunteers working to help our staff, and I see some of them here tonight, which is also incredible. And I think this is a perfect program, very fitting, because our speaker tonight, Dr. Titus, was actually involved with the creation of the museum in reviewing and in advising as we put together the script. And that was a wonderful opportunity to work with you. So thank you to Dr. Titus. And I should note, too, she was a professor of mine not too long ago at Gettysburg College. So it's an honor to have you here tonight. And with that, I will give a little bit more of a biography. Jill Ogline Titus is Associate Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College and co-coordinator of the college's Public History minor. She's the author of Gettysburg 1963, Civil Rights, Cold War Politics, and Historical Memory in America's Most Famous Small Town. I should mention that is a very recent publication, 2021, and is available in our gift shop if you'd like to get a copy after this presentation. I highly recommend that. She's also the author of Brown's Battleground: Students, Segregationists, and the Struggle for Justice in Prince Edward County, which was published in 2011 by UNC Press. Her articles and reviews have appeared in the Journal of Southern History, the Public Historian, History News, and Journal of the Civil War Era, which I think is a Gettysburg College publication. Or different one, that's right, there's two, or probably five. At Gettysburg College, she teaches courses in modern American history, public history, African American history, and historical memory, and she oversees many of the college's public history initiatives. Before that, from 2007 to 2012, she was Associate Director of the C.V. Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. And prior to that, she was a National Park Service ranger, and I believe at Gettysburg for a while, and received her PhD subsequently from the University of Massachusetts in 2007. And Dr. Titus, as I said, has been really just wonderful in her involvement in the community with the Historical Society and recognizing the importance of organizations like ours and how the bond between academic institutions and public history sites like ours is just so important to maintain and to continue into the future. So without further ado, thank you so much, Dr. Jill Titus, for being here tonight. Thank you.
I think I'll put it in. Well, thank you so much, Andrew, for that lovely introduction, and thank you to Abby and Tim and everybody else for the opportunity to be here this evening. I'm really looking forward to talking about this project here, because truly this book would not exist without the research collection behind me. The Adams County Historical Society holdings were essential to this project, and I want to thank all of the familiar faces in here, the volunteers in the reading room over at the Wolf House who helped me find things and drug all sorts of vertical files out for me and have been so helpful through this process. So really, this project began actually with the landscape itself. My husband was a student at the seminary here about 10 years ago, and we lived in campus housing, which of course had its ups and downs. But one of the great upsides to this was I was able to walk in the evening along Seminary Ridge and watch the sunset across the sky, which, as you all know, is just an absolutely gorgeous sight. And because of where we lived, I inevitably ended up walking along West Confederate Avenue and taking note of the large Confederate monuments, reading the inscriptions, looking at the dedication plaques. And as a 20th century US historian who knows far more about 1963 than I do about 1863, it was immediately obvious to me that that part of the battlefield's commemorative landscape had a lot more to do with the 20th century than it did with the 19th. 5 of the large Confederate monuments along Seminary Ridge were dedicated between 1961 and 1965 during the 100th anniversary commemoration of the Civil War, and 3 more were added in the next 8 years. As I started digging into the archives and the newspaper records to learn more about who placed these monuments and why, it became clear that these commemorative pieces were really windows into a larger story. And that story was one about the ways in which 20th century Americans from across the political spectrum used the Battle of Gettysburg to fight the Cold War, to define the United States' place in a rapidly changing world, and to both champion and attempt to crush the swelling tide of the civil rights movement. On a more local level, here in Adams County, it was also a story of grassroots efforts to strike a balance between economic development, tourist amenities, and landscape preservation, as well as National Park Service attempts to leverage the anniversary to boost the agency's profile with visitors and justify building a long-needed museum facility. Both segregationists and civil rights activists saw inherent opportunities in the Gettysburg commemoration. Confederate heritage enthusiasts believed that the Centennial could advance their goal of memorializing their ancestors and their values here on the nation's most famous Civil War battlefield, and helping to ensure that their conviction that the Confederacy was an exemplar of American values would be passed on to future generations. Many of them, though not all, certainly, drew open and direct connections between the war for Confederate nationhood and the massive resistance campaigns sweeping the South. Black activists, white progressives, and members of Pennsylvania's state-level Human Relations Commission, on the other hand, saw in the anniversary commemoration an opportunity to leverage widespread concerns about Gettysburg's public image to fight segregation and discrimination here in South Central Pennsylvania. So before we go any further with the Gettysburg specific story, I just want to set the stage a little bit with some broader context. The centennial anniversary of the Civil War, of course, took place at a time of dramatic political and social upheaval around the world. The world's 2 leading superpowers were, of course, locked in a Cold War standoff. Dozens of newly independent nations with majority non-white populations were coming into existence in Africa and Asia. Back home in the US, the modern civil rights movement was at its height, as were concerns about national security. Americans were, with good reason, fixated on their image on the world stage. They wanted people around the world to see the United States as a nation of individuals who were committed to democracy and ready to give all in defense of their country and its bedrock political principles. But the reality, as so often is, was more complicated than that. The democracy that many white Americans were holding up as inherently superior to communism was deeply flawed. It had never delivered on the promise of equal rights for all. And 100 years after the war that abolished racial slavery, Black Americans were in the midst of a major assault on the white supremacist system that replaced it. Many white Southerners responded to street demonstrations and direct action protests, like sit-ins, with violence. White Southerners and political conservatives also clashed, sometimes violently, with federal officials who were attempting to enforce court decisions and laws mandating equal opportunity. In addition to civil rights clashes, battles over civil liberties in wartime, Cold War time, were widespread, as fears of communism continued to haunt most Americans and undermine causes on the left side of the political spectrum. So the men and women, they were largely men, but not entirely, at the helm of nationwide planning for the Civil War centennial, hoped that commemorating this war could help bridge these divisions and rehabilitate the United States' image around the world through demonstrating the depths of citizens' commitment to democracy. So leaders of the federally appointed Civil War Centennial Commission mapped out an inspirational celebration that basically portrayed the Civil War along the lines of a football rivalry. In their presentation, the Civil War mattered primarily because it helped pave the nation's path towards superpower status. In their view, the post-war reunion and supposed reconciliation of North and South not only gave the US the large population that it needed to be a superpower, but also preserved representative democracy and self-government as bulwarks against totalitarianism and communism. So their approach to commemorating the war mostly avoided discussion of anything that could be perceived as controversial, and generally avoided the contentious question of what emancipation had or hadn't accomplished. The commemorative activities that played out here in Gettysburg were overseen by the state-level Gettysburg Centennial Commission and a local body, the Adams County Civil War Centennial Commission, not the Federal Civil War Centennial Commission, but they embodied a number of the same themes. But there were important differences as well. Namely, the extent to which the emancipationist interpretation of the battle carved out space here in Gettysburg next to more widely embraced lost cause or reconciliationist interpretations. So the question of why that is, I think there are a number of answers. One, timing played a role. This, of course, is 1963, not 1961, and quite a bit had changed on the national landscape in those 2 years. Gettysburg is also the place that is so intimately connected with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, with the ideals of that address, the representative democracy of a new birth of freedom. And this was also a place where powerful white Southern politicians had much less influence over the program of events than they did on a national scale. So for, I think, obvious reasons, the Gettysburg commemoration was one of the most high-profile and popular of all of the events that took place between 1961 and 1965 in terms of commemorating the war. It really did capture attention around the world. But if planning had happened a little bit differently, Gettysburg might not have been only one of the standouts of the centennial. It might have been the actual embodiment of the centennial commemoration itself. So let me tell you what I mean. As preparations for the 100th anniversary of the war started to kick into high gear in the mid-1950s, some officials at the highest levels of the National Park Service argued that the nation's, and by extension, the agency's best interests wouldn't be served by commemorating every aspect of a 4-year war. They pushed instead for a commemoration that would be totally focused on Gettysburg, devoted to protecting unprotected lands and building a comprehensive new museum of the American Civil War. So these officials, who were led by a man named Daniel Tobin, who was the director of the Northeast Regional Office of the Park Service at that time, warned that a program of commemorative activities that would be helmed by a federal commission but carried out by local people around the country would run the risk of producing a bunch of tacky celebrations, a lot of partisan debates, and what they delicately called many embarrassing incidents. Better to take a one-shot approach. They argued that Gettysburg was the natural place to make the centerpiece of the nation's Civil War landscape because most people already thought of it that way anyway. In making his case for Gettysburg, Tobin insisted that it was not only the most significant battlefield of the war, it was also a Union victory. It had a history of being used for reconciliationist purposes, and it was located north of the Mason-Dixon line, where he assumed that tensions over segregation and federal authority would be less flammable. I'm always intrigued by the language that he used in making this case because it seems to me that, at least to a certain extent, he and his colleagues at least somewhat subscribed to the idea that racism was a Southern problem, that north of the Mason-Dixon line, these issues didn't exist. And of course, that is untrue. Gettysburg, Pennsylvania is a community with a long history of racial discrimination, a point that we'll discuss in a little bit more detail later. So in the end, critics of this plan to focus all of the Centennial activities and energy and funding on Gettysburg lost. But those who had made the argument clung determinedly to one element of their vision, a standalone museum and visitor services facility that would allow Gettysburg National Military Park to better compete, I mean, that's really the language they used, with private tour companies and private museums for visitors' attention, and would provide space for National Park Service interpretation of the battle, which really didn't exist at that time. So we'll come back to this visitor comfort facility in just a few minutes, but just want to first briefly sketch out a picture of the landscape that would surround it. So disagreements about land use and the proper balance between development and preservation have been part of Adams County politics since, what, July 4th, 1863? I mean, forever, essentially. But by 1961, preservationists were on the defensive. They felt that they were fighting a losing battle against commercial encroachment on the field. Local officials' concern for growing the tax base, the needs of an increasing population, the local population was growing dramatically during the 50s and 60s, and the new amenities associated with the expansion of car-based tourism had produced a landscape that a lot of people said was virtually indistinguishable from Gatlinburg or Niagara Falls. One disgruntled visitor wrote the Secretary of the Interior in 1960 that downtown Gettysburg had become a farce. She had no issues with private enterprise, she insisted, quote, "but here is practiced highway robbery without the benefit of a gun." Some Adams County residents certainly cared deeply about the integrity of battlefield land, but others really chafed at restrictions on its usage. When National Park Service officials pointed out publicly that Gettysburg National Military Park had lost access to more than $1 million earmarked for battlefield preservation because Adams County didn't have zoning laws, most residents were completely unmoved by that argument. They countered that zoning would cripple the local economy and that the Department of the Interior had no right to ram it down their throats. Among those people who were advocating for preservation, motivations very much differed. For some, preservation made savvy business sense. One local resident observed that compromising the land that tourists came here to see was the equivalent of killing the goose that lays the golden eggs. Others were moved more by a conviction that the bloodshed on this field made the ground sacred, or that the Battle of Gettysburg couldn't be adequately understood without the permanent preservation of land outside park boundaries. Two major threats to the first day's battlefield in 1959, one of which was the Adams County Commissioner's decision to sell the old Poor Farm site to the highest bidder in order to bring in funds to build a new home for the elderly, jolted preservationists of all stripes to go back to the drawing board and try a different approach. Their new organization, the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association, of course, the GBPA, took it really as a given that zoning and publicly funded land acquisition were just off the table for the foreseeable future. So they focused their attention instead on raising private funds to buy land and donate it to the NPS. Parade magazine ran a story on Gettysburg's preservation woes in January 1961, offering readers an opportunity to donate to the GBPA by purchasing a Civil War portfolio of images and maps. And in response to this, donations poured in from around the country. as did letters to the Gettysburg Times, vilifying the county commissioners as small-minded and morally bankrupt. Some of these letters used very colorful language. They were somewhat entertaining to read. One parade reader argued caustically that a new home for the elderly wasn't necessary because most of the people in the current one were going to die within 10 years anyway. As I read that, I thought, I really hope no one ever appointed you their power of attorney. This is disturbing. Another writer insisted that the land on which the battle was fought might fall within the borders of Adams County, but that didn't give the commissioners the right to do whatever they wanted with it. The battlefield, he said, belonged to the nation. One woman who very dramatically claimed that her husband had played on what she called Gettysburg's blood-soaked fields in a potato sack dress as a child, angrily demanded that the White House should divert money used for so-called European handouts to battlefield preservation. The letters didn't save the poor farm property, but the loss of the site really was a bit of a financial windfall for the Gettysburg Battlefield Preservation Association. It gave it the financial resources necessary to acquire several properties during the Centennial years. And leaders of the group made very effective use of the publicity value of the Centennial during the midpoint of the 1960s, arguing that if whatever land didn't get saved in 1963 while everybody was focused on Gettysburg, you might as well forget it. That land was lost forever, so write a bigger check today. Somewhat ironically, given the role of the National Park Service as the caretaker of most of the battlefield's preserved land, when it came time for the agency to select a location for this long-awaited Gettysburg National Military Park Visitor Center, the parcel chosen left a lot of preservationists really shaking their heads. The new visitor center, finally made possible by the convergence of the Centennial with the Park Service's Mission 66 program, which made a bunch of money available to create visitor centers and other improvements across the NPS system, would be located in Ziegler's Grove, at the midpoint between the Angle, Meade's headquarters, and the National Cemetery. There was no getting around the fact that this was historically significant ground. But NPS officials, influenced by an agency-wide tendency at the time to prioritize accessibility concerns above everything else, argued that visitor centers should be located in high-profile sites where visitors were already congregating. Gettysburg National Military Park superintendent insisted that placing the new building at the heart of the battlefield landscape would allow it to, quote, do the most good on behalf of the visitors. Daniel Tobin, that regional director who had wanted Gettysburg to be the focus of the Centennial, argued that the new visitor center, here I'm going to quote briefly, would not be an incongruous building intruding on the historic landscape, but an appropriate Centennial memorial, fully as fitting for prominence in the park as the many and varied types of commemorative monuments that now dot this great battlefield. Whatever would be built was expected to do a lot more than just effectively serve visitors and house park offices and exhibits. That building was supposed to be a monument in its own right. The building ultimately constructed to embody this vision, which many of us in this room probably remember, not necessarily as the original visitor center, but rather as the Cyclorama Center, stood until 2013, when it was torn down, not without controversy, on the grounds that it was exactly what Daniel Tobin promised that it wouldn't be, an incongruous building intruding on the historic landscape. The building was also, and bear with me on this, a permanent testimony to the influence of Cold War politics on the battlefield's commemorative landscape. So you might raise your eyebrows at that. I absolutely understand. But let me walk you through the backstory of this building, which I find absolutely fascinating. So to create their functional Centennial Memorial, the NPS turned to Richard Neutra, one of the world's most famous modern architects. Neutra's design presented the building as both a living monument to Abraham Lincoln and a shrine for the free world. That was his language, a three-dimensional teaching tool for democracy. Some architectural historians, which I am absolutely not, I can hardly tell you the difference between an eave and a cornice, but some people who know a lot more about architecture than I do have argued that the white of the rotunda was supposed to be reminiscent of white marble, that it was supposed to signify the building's identity as a memorial. And they've also made the argument that that tinted glass in the windows that you see was supposed to evoke the idea of memory, like gesturing to historical figures that had once been present in this landscape, but now only exist as memories, that this was a deeply symbolic design. Again, I can't tell you the difference between an eave and a cornice, so I can't really speak to the validity of that, but those arguments have been made. What I do know, in part from personal experience, was that the building was a show, in its prime anyway, the building was a showcase of space-age technology. It had louvered blinds that self-adjusted as the sun moved across the sky. I think that's still pretty cool in 2023. It had walls that retracted at the push of a button. It had a sound and light show in the drum where you would see the painting. That was high tech. I mean, everybody who'd ever seen a cyclorama painting before that had done it with a live guide. And now, wow, you have audio, you have sound, you have lights, all of these things. After Star Trek premiered in 1966, some NPS people started calling the cyclorama building the Starship Enterprise. But its cutting-edge technology was intended to do a lot more than just give visitors a modern and comfortable place to get oriented. In putting this space-age building at the heart of the battlefield landscape, Neutra was hoping to encourage visitors to think about the relationship between past and present. He really saw this building as a physical embodiment of the advantages of Western capitalism and the superiority of American political principles, as expressed in the Gettysburg Address. He saw this building as an embodiment of everything that he hoped would draw these newly independent nations around the world to the United States. We have fantastic technology, we have all this cutting-edge technology, and our political system is built on representative democracy. This is what will make the United States ultimately supreme and come out of the Cold War as the clear victor. For Neutra, the whole reason that this battle mattered was because of what Abraham Lincoln said here in November of 1963. That vision of the United States as the world's shining example of government of the people, by the people, for the people. I mean, think about this in the context of the Cold War for a moment. You know, at the height of the Cold War, that was an interpretation of America's place in the world that was really sort of tailor-made for export. So Neutra and his team envisioned this building as not just a visitor center where people would watch a film and see the cyclorama and see some exhibits and get a map and use the bathroom, but also a space for foreign leaders to learn about American democracy and build political ties with the United States. The whole design for this building revolved around plans for an annual international forum that would bring leaders from across the globe, including behind the Iron Curtain, to Gettysburg to focus on developing strategies for preserving peace in a world that was always, threatened with nuclear war. The doors under the rotunda, those were the ones that retracted. The idea was to create this sort of indoor-outdoor auditorium space for what he expected would be large-scale programs. And Neutra didn't just see this building as the architectural shell in which these programs were going to take place. For him, the building itself was almost transcendent. He told a group of contractors before they broke ground that the world leaders would need to keep their speeches short because the building is most important and comes first. I find that really interesting. I don't suppose you said that to any of your contractors. He later got into a really bitter argument with Gettysburg National Military Park officials when they proposed, in his words, to desecrate the building by putting in exterior signage pointing people to the restrooms. He indignantly asked park staff if they would treat the Taj Mahal with such disrespect. I haven't found their response, but I think I can probably imagine it. Nonetheless, National Park Service leaders were initially delighted with their new building. It was the largest, the most expensive, and the most modern visitor center in the national park system, and for a while, the grandest public and most acclaimed public building in Pennsylvania. Architectural critics loved this building. They raved. One concluded that Neutra's functional Centennial Memorial admirably met the criteria for a successful public building, which apparently, according to this man, were letting the visitor know at once where he is, why he is there, and where the toilet is. Although, apparently, like I just said, that last one didn't come without a fight. At the dedication ceremony held on November 19th, 1962, the 99th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, NPS officials pointed to this newly completed building as the agency's central contribution to the Civil War centennial. It wasn't what they had had in mind a few years ago when they wanted the entire commemoration to revolve around Gettysburg, but it was, in their minds, a permanent contribution to the preservation and interpretation of the history of the American Civil War, something that would stand for all time, or at least until 2013. Okay, so aside from the campaign to build the visitor center, the real bulk of the vision and energy driving the Gettysburg Centennial in its earlier years was actually local in origin and focus. The state-level Gettysburg Centennial Commission had been established in 1956 to coordinate commemoration of the battle anniversary and the Gettysburg Address anniversary. But it was slow to find its footing. It had hit a lot of political obstacles. Members of the Adams County Civil War Centennial Commission, however, really hit the ground running. They assumed that the state commission would ultimately pull it together in time to adequately commemorate the men who fought at Gettysburg, which it did. So they took their charge to be the responsibility of honoring county residents who served in the war at any point, and focusing on Adams County's contributions from Fort Sumter to Appomattox. The group kicked off its programming efforts in spring 1961 by staging a large pageant reenacting the April 1861 departure of the Independent Blues, the first regiment of local men to leave for wartime service. The pageant was written by a committee of local people, and it featured a cast of 300, including many prominent locals in key roles. The county commissioners, the town council president, and the burgess all portrayed their 1861 predecessors. They apparently all had sideburns and mustaches grown specifically for the occasion as well. The Gettysburg College Band filled in for the community band that had performed in 1861, and high school students donned the uniforms of the National Cadets, a teenage military group that had formed with the departure of the Blues. And the fact that Daniel Skelly Jr., the son of the cadets' captain, portrayed his own father in this pageant is testimony to just how narrow the chasm still was that separated past from present in Gettysburg, where many mid-20th century residents were the direct descendants of wartime residents, but father to son even, that 100 years later, that's remarkable. So members of the newly established reenactment group, the North-South Skirmish Association, represented the Home Guard that fired cannon to mark the Blues' departure. And reenacting, as some of you may remember, was a rapidly growing hobby in the early 1960s, but it was still new enough that nobody really anticipated that firing cannon in the middle of Lincoln Square could be a problem until 16 windows shattered. Otherwise, though, it seems that the event was a great success. It drew a huge crowd, I think more than 3,000 people. And the local Civil War Centennial Commission went on to sponsor 2 more pageants the following year. Many Adams County residents who were active in centennial activities shared a lot of the same goals of those state and federal planners that, they wanted to celebrate Gettysburg as a site of patriotic unity. They wanted to celebrate Gettysburg as the source of the sort of democratic vision guiding the free world. But that doesn't mean that either their use of battle narratives or their reasons for remembering the Civil War were identical to those of federal officials or the state commission. Notwithstanding Gettysburg's widespread fame, it was still a small town where kinship networks were of utmost importance, and family stories played a huge role in shaping local people's enthusiasm for historical commemoration. This really strong emphasis on family connections linking 1863 to 1963 was particularly visible in this, which was the local commission's final pageant, which commemorated the June 27th, 1863 capture of Gettysburg by Jubal Early's cavalry and the death of local resident George Washington Sandow. The program involved more than 600 people, excuse me, and included a mock skirmish in the downtown area, as you can see here, a reenactment of the capture of the courthouse, and a scripted scene recreating the delivery of Early's demands to Borough Council President David Kendall Hart. A descendant portrayed Sandow, and the role of David Kendall Hart went to his grandson, Joseph. The pageants sponsored by the ACCWCC, I've never found that easy to say, that one just does not roll off the tongue, and the preservation work of the GBPA were also sort of augmented and supported by efforts on part of the Junior Chamber of Commerce, better known as the JCs, to restore the downtown business district to its 1863 appearance. That didn't blow up well, I apologize. On the grounds that historically accurate architecture would draw more tourists to the area around Lincoln Square. Former President Eisenhower, who was a big champion of private voluntary financial action as opposed to governmental investment, was a big supporter of this campaign, which was called Campaign Gettysburg, and he played a really important role in getting the Saturday Evening Post to underwrite a lot of the costs. By the beginning of 1963, about 3/4 of the buildings that had been identified for historical improvements had been worked on, and representatives of the Post lauded the campaign as a triumph of commercial democracy, which I don't know what that means. I've been thinking about that for years, and I still don't know what it means. But the campaign culminated a few weeks before the battle anniversary with a Civil War sing-along on the square, a drummer boy contest. All of the contestants got a free day at Fantasyland as a thank you for entering. And Campaign Gettysburg sales days, which included competition for the best Civil War-themed shop windows downtown. Many of the business owners who participated in the campaign also angled to boost their sales by placing historically themed advertisements in the special centennial edition of the Gettysburg Times that was printed on June 30th. The ads are really, really interesting to peruse, particularly as windows into the sort of inherent promise of the post-war American economy, that purchasing the right consumer goods could help the purchaser kind of tap into some supposed deep vein of national character, a lot of the ads in the Centennial issue used nostalgic portrayals of the past to prompt readers to associate certain products or services with the supposed sort of small town America values of honesty and integrity and quality craftsmanship. But others made very specific connections to the Civil War. Dengler Brothers Grocery informed readers that the armies came to Gettysburg by chance, not choice, but promised that you can choose and eat hearty at bargain prices. As you see in the image here, Columbia Gas of Pennsylvania capitalized on the fact that the eternal peace light flame was fueled by natural gas, stressing gas's role in uniting the American economy. A lot of the advertisements were reconciliationist in tone. They incorporated both Union and Confederate flags to assure visitors of varying regional and political loyalties that local business owners were properly respectful of the valor of both sides. Some of these ads explicitly embrace the narrative that the Civil War laid the groundwork for the United States to grow into a global superpower. There are some really interesting ones with comparing technology, cutting-edge technology of 1863 versus cutting-edge technology of 1963, and making that case that what they did now has allowed us to grow into the most powerful nation in the world. But very, very, very few of these ads made any suggestions or inferences as to why the war had been fought. Discussions of historical causation and consequences don't tend to be as good for business as nostalgic allusions to old-time values or images like that. The grassroots commemorative efforts of the ACC, WCC, the GBPA, and the JCs, and the town's business community existed side by side and sometimes in tandem with those that were undertaken by the state-level Gettysburg Centennial Commission. From the get-go, members of the GCC committed themselves to three things. One, they wanted to demonstrate that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania was appropriately cognizant of the importance of Gettysburg. Two, they wanted to boost the state's tourist economy. And three, they wanted to make use of Gettysburg's symbolic value as a bulwark against communism. So by late 1962, the commission had laid the groundwork for a battle anniversary commemoration that would heighten public understanding of what members called the immense reserves of bravery, sacrifice, and idealism which lie in the American character. They would get there by creating a grand patriotic spectacle: parades, pageants, reenactments, sound and light shows that would stir people's historical imaginations and kind of rouse their emotions. So for help in making that vision a reality, GCC members turned to Adele Gutman Nathan, a theater producer who had successfully mounted a bunch of large-scale historical pageants, including one in Gettysburg several years earlier. And Nathan agreed to develop a whole range of theatrical programs for the anniversary and organize a massive parade, the highlight of which would turn out to be a National Guard float featuring a soldier taking a shower in a mobile bath unit. That is what people remembered most about that parade. She told a reporter a few months before the battle anniversary that her job was to bring the wow factor. "These people are historians," she said. "They know history, but they don't know show business," and that's what this is. As a historian, kind of agree. She's right in general about us. Nathan quickly established a partnership with Betty Gifford, the chairperson of the ACC-WCC's pageant committee, and turned over to her the responsibility of developing a series of historically, human interest-themed historical vignettes for performance around the battlefield on July 2nd and July 3rd. And Gifford, for her part, drew on her connections within the community to make these programs a reality. She assembled a cast and a crew for all of them, a team of researchers and script writers, assortment of volunteers to coordinate the makeup and keep track of the props and do all of the designs. Most of her volunteers were really, really eager to play a role in their community's time in the spotlight, but at least a few were dragooned into participation by bosses and supervisors who were determined to show their public spiritedness. Betty Gifford became so committed to the vignettes that she soldiered on with them despite her husband suffering a heart attack that kept him in the hospital the whole way through battle anniversary week. And there were 7 vignettes. They averaged about 5 minutes apiece, and they were located all across the battlefield. They were really popular with visitors, although NPS officials sort of privately complained that they left something to be desired in terms of historical accuracy. This one, which is a little hard to see, but there are soldiers here in front of the rocks. This is Sharpshooter's Roost, and this one depicted the battle action around Devil's Den. Brother Captures Brother, another one, was a sentimental story of brothers torn apart by the war, encountering each other on the battlefield. There was A Valiant General, a noble man, that kind of hit all the lost cause marks in its portrayal of Robert E. Lee. This one, Life Saved by a Gentleman, featured the familiar but likely somewhat embellished story of Confederate General John B. Gordon saving the life of Union General Francis Barlow. There was The Fateful Decision. That one portrayed Meade's July 2nd Council of War. This one, Friendly Enemies, depicted a historically inaccurate tableau of opposing forces playing cards together after filling their canteens at Spangler Spring. And the last one, John Burns, focused on the, of course, well-known story of the elderly man who joined Union troops in defending his home. And NPS staff were certainly right that the history underpinning many of the vignettes was a little suspect. But at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize these dramatic pieces for what they were. They were an attempt to give visitors a human-scale story and an emotional connection to the past. And I think we kind of take it as a given that historical interpretation will do that today. But most Gettysburg programming in the early 1960s, whether it was presented by NPS rangers or battlefield guides or other local museums, was very heavy on tactics, military maneuvers, the actions of very high-level commanders. It's very light on human-scale stories. And things weren't much different in the academic world either. The idea that the experiences of common, ordinary people, like enlisted soldiers or town residents, the idea that those mattered, that those were important in their own right, was really just starting to take root in scholarly circles. So yes, these vignettes had some problems, but whatever their flaws, they captured visitors' attention by connecting them on an emotional level with the experiences of people who played a role in this battle. And that kind of bedrock assertion that the people of the past, whether they were soldiers or civilians, were real people with real emotions, real fears, connections, identities that transcended just their battle actions. That, I think, really hinted at a new interpretive approach that would flower in Gettysburg over the next decade. Gifford estimated that more than 50,000 people saw the 200-plus vignette performances. A lot of people came back to see particular ones again and again. I've read of at least one person who walked the whole 7-mile circuit to see all of them on the same day. The president of the Gettysburg Civil War Roundtable proclaimed in the aftermath of the battle anniversary that the vignettes, cast and crew did more with a few dollars than the state did with $128,000. This was a front page news in the Gettysburg Times. Again, kind of a questionable assertion, but you clearly see the local pride in what was being accomplished here and what had been contributed by local people themselves. All right. I didn't time this particularly well, so I need to cut a little bit. Cut a little bit here. Okay, I know what I'm going to do. One of the GCC's greatest challenges was figuring out how to reconcile visitors' expectations that the Gettysburg Centennial would include a big battle reenactment with the National Park Service's new policy forbidding reenactments on NPS property, which was put into effect after a fairly disastrous reenactment at Manassas in 1961. So the compromise that they ultimately came up with was a symbolic reenactment of the third day's assault, which the chairman of the GCC described as an opportunity to interpret the battlefield in a way that will emphasize our present position as a great nation united under a single flag. Again, sort of Cold War language, Cold War ideology here. A very substantial percentage of the about 1,500 uniformed participants in this symbolic reenactment, including maybe some of these pictured, were descendants of Civil War veterans. At least a few were female, which I find really interesting. You know, this was decades before women went to court over the right to participate in battle reenactments, and here at Gettysburg in 1963, the 104th Ohio had 8 women in uniform. All of the Union units participating were from northern states, but some of the Confederate groups also hailed from north of the Mason-Dixon line, as sort of a testimony to the popularity of Confederate reenacting and perhaps to a certain extent some Confederate ideology outside of the South. Weather was a problem throughout the battle anniversary. July 1st, July 2nd. July 1st was super hot. July 2nd was a downpour. July 3rd was the first sort of good weather day. So this commemoration of Pickett's charge, this was the first of the Centennial events that really drew the size of a crowd that planners had expected would be coming to everything. We're talking about nearly 40,000 people out near the angle. And this, of course, posed some real crowd control challenges for the NPS staff and the state troopers and the Boy Scouts who were charged with maintaining order out there. A lot of attendees couldn't see very well, and a few arguments broke out over news cameras blocking sight lines. At one point, some people in the crowd actually rushed an elevated platform holding the cameras, started shaking it back and forth with the cameraman kind of hanging on for dear life up there. But for people who could see well, the sight was very memorable. There's about 600 Confederate reenactors slowly approaching the angle, kind of climbing over the fences along the Emmitsburg Road, pushing back a skirmishing force of Union soldiers. This was all done without using the weapons that they were carrying. By directive of the NPS, participants could not point their weapons, they could not load them, they could not simulate injury or death. Sounds and visuals were provided instead by smoke pots and recorded gunfire and battle sounds. As the Confederate attackers kind of neared the Union line, participants on both sides lowered their weapons, kind of clutched each other's hands. A lot of people had tears in their eyes. The Navy band played the national anthem. Everybody, well, the participants assembled at attention behind the angle to salute the American flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. And I always think about, what did this event mean to people who took part in it? Some of you might be able to answer that question. I mean, every talk I've ever given on this has included at least one person who was present in Gettysburg for at least part of the Centennial commemoration. And of course, I'm always like, why didn't I meet you 4 years ago when I could have interviewed you? And it would have been great. But many people who were in the crowd that day as children have told me that what they remember most was just the excitement, the sense that history was close enough to touch. Another man, someone I interviewed who was older at the time, told me that people in the crowd definitely would not have thought that they were looking at this through Cold War lenses, but in retrospect, it made sense to him that many people probably were. By thinking about the wars and the uprisings that were taking place around the world at the time, being grateful that the US was militarily powerful enough to fight back against Soviet expansion, and wondering if it would have had that power, if it would be the nation that it was if the Union line had broken out here on July 3rd. There's more that I could say about this program. There are other fascinating dimensions to it, but since I am rapidly running out of the time that I was allotted, I want to kind of wrap up by saying that, ultimately, the Gettysburg Centennial was many things to many people. It boosted the local tourist economy. It gave birth to new kinds of preservationist campaigns. It spurred large-scale popular participation in historical pageantry. The centennial years dramatically changed the battlefield's commemorative landscape. They turned the Ziegler's Grove area into the new interpretive heart of the visitor experience. The centennial years ushered in a wave of Confederate monumentation that would continue for the next 14 years. The post-centennial transformation of Seminary Ridge into full-fledged Confederate memorial space really, I think, is a testimony to the entrenchment of sort of traditional narratives of reconciliation and states' rights during the anniversary, but at the same time, a point that I didn't unfortunately have time to talk about, the centennial years also saw a decrease in overt racial segregation in Adams County, in part through actions that were driven by concern about public image, concern about news reports, concern that there would be incidents if visitors of color were turned away from hotels or restaurants or other local establishments. And this sort of savvy and sophisticated use of that concern on the part of civil rights activists to continue to break down racial barriers in this community. So at the same time, the centennial years also saw the beginning of a somewhat more racially inclusive and historically complex narrative of Gettysburg's meaning, as well as a narrative, as I was saying earlier, that was more focused on kind of human scale stories and the experiences of ordinary people. In their commemorative activities, members of the Gettysburg Centennial Commission tried really hard to de-emphasize the divisiveness of the Civil War, which of course is a challenge when you're trying to use a civil war to portray your nation as unified and patriotic. They mounted a lot of programs like those vignettes of history, or like that July 3rd Pickett's Charge production, which used patriotic spectacle and human stories to reinforce the message that we're all Americans. But GCC leaders couldn't control all of the diverse messaging created by different populations over the course of the centennial era. Despite their efforts, Lost Cause and emancipationist interpretations of the battle joined reconciliationist ones in being put to work for present-day purposes. Americans used Gettysburg in 1963 to justify and to oppose the Civil Rights Bill in front of Congress at the time, to lament the impact of American racial abuses on the nation's foreign policy goals, and to call for equal justice in housing and employment. They also used the memory of the battle to link the Black freedom struggle to communism and to portray civil rights activists as dangerous agitators who were anti-American and opposed to the best aspects of the American tradition. So all in all, the commemoration of the Civil War centennial was inseparable from the prosecution of the Cold War and the struggle for Black freedom, both in the United States and around the world. How people thought about history mattered. It influenced how they thought about the present, just as much as the way that people thought about the present influenced how they understood the history of this battle and its legacy. So thank you.